No topic could be more important to our futures, the futures of our children, our grandchildren, indeed to the nation itself, than the topic presented today of a responsible U.S. federal budget. And we are very honored to have a very qualified speaker to enlighten us on this important topic. Now, in the situation the country's in, their trillion dollar deficits are set to return this year, and already record high national debt is going to keep skyrocketing over the coming decade. And it's hard to see, given what's going on in Washington, how that's going to get fixed. But today we are very honored. We have Mike Murphy, the Chief of Staff and Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He manages policy research and analysis on a variety of topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget, as well as coordinates a wide array of projects related to advancing the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget's policy-related initiatives. And so without further delay, please help me in welcoming Mike Murphy.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all of you for having me here today. I am honored always to be asked to speak. We speak to a lot of Rotary clubs around the country, but I will admit I am particularly happy to be thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C. This week in particular, and it seems like every week these days. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. And I will say, I just said that we speak to a lot of Rotary clubs, but I will admit this is one of the most beautiful venues for a Rotary club that I have been to. I also say I speak to a lot of Rotary clubs, so I like it because I kind of know the format is pretty consistent across clubs, and it's always the case that I get to speak kind of after the meal has been served, which is good because we kind of have a tendency to ruin people's meals, okay, with the news I'm about to tell you. Spoiler alert, yeah, what I'm about to tell you is pretty grim and depressing information. Before I get into the meat of what I'm going to talk to you about today, and I'm going to try and give you the talk as quickly and efficiently as I can, because I hear that folks like to ask questions, so I want to get to some question and discussion here. Let me give you a big picture, a little bit more about myself, my organization, and what I'm doing in Arizona today. A little bit more about me. I'm Chief of Staff and Director of Strategic Initiatives at a group called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Good. Thank you for not laughing. I heard someone laugh a little bit because it tends to be a little bit of a, misnomer these days, oxymoron, unfortunately, in Washington. But we are a public policy organization in D.C., nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that educates the public policymakers on issues related to the federal budget, with a particular focus on advancing fiscal responsibility and trying to get our debt under control. Myself, I've been working there for about 6 years as Chief of Staff. I come to budget issues not with, I'm not an economist. I don't have a huge background in fiscal policy. I don't have an affinity for big and strong, big scary numbers, which we'll show you a bunch of those. I come to this more as a background in politics and public policy generally. I worked for a few different public policy issues before coming to this, coming to the committee. But I got interested in this for some of those bigger value-based questions. Call me crazy, but I believe a nation's budget should reflect what our nation stands for. It should be a reflection of our nation's priorities. What do we value? How are we investing in the future? What kind of country we're leaving behind for future generations? These kind of value questions are what drew me to be interested in working on the federal budget. And so I've been working on this now for about 6 years. And what I'm doing here today is I'm part of a swing through this beautiful state of Arizona to speak to a few different audiences as part of what we're calling a roadshow effort, where we're just going outside the Beltway and educating folks on this issue on the budget, and also how the budget reflects some deeper political problems that we're facing right now in Washington, and how we need to address those, all with the goal of doing a small part in encouraging folks to engage with policymakers and bring attention to an issue that we really think requires some more attention. So with that, I'm going to get into the meat of this presentation. Yeah, we're a budget group, so we got a lot of charts, we got a lot of numbers I'm about to throw at you here. I'm going to try and go through this really quick, as quickly as I can to get to some questions. But just before I get started, you should know everything I'm about to show you, these aren't numbers that we make up at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. These come from official government nonpartisan sources like the Congressional Budget Office, Treasury, Office of Management and Budget, the GAO in Washington, and other sources. Now, the last thing I'll say before getting into the numbers here, this stuff's technical, it's kind of wonky, it's pretty complicated. Okay, so what I like to do is distill it down, what I call 15 facts, 15 key points. So I'm going to show you 15 different slides here that try to distill this down to what I think is some of the core message that we think resonates. Okay, hold on. That would help. Let's see if this works. There you go. Okay, point number one, starting at a very basic high level here. The federal government's fiscal year, the United States federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30th. So the 2019 fiscal year just recently ended. For fiscal year 2019, the U.S. federal government spent $4.4 trillion approximately and took in about $3.5 trillion in annual revenue. That leaves an annual gap of over $900 billion for last fiscal year. It was actually about $930 billion, I think was the final number. Pretty significant gap. However, point number two, as was said in the introduction, trillion-dollar-plus annual deficits are projected to return this year. It wasn't too long ago in our history that we had trillion-dollar-plus deficits at the height of the Great Recession. They are expected to return this year. Here's the big difference, however, from the previous time that we had trillion-dollar-plus annual deficits. Our trillion-dollar-plus annual deficits are expected to return, remain, and grow permanently for as far as the eye can see. Point number three. Quick terminology thing here. It's often the case people kind of interchange the use of the word deficits and debt in the context of federal kind of budget issues. Deficits, the annual difference between spending and revenues. Debt, the accumulation of those past deficits. Many people think of the national debt, they think of the $23 trillion gross national debt number. That's not the number that most public policy analysts, economists, and others that are looking at this issue tend to focus on as a metric. The metric that we look at is what is our debt relative to our economy? What's the debt to GDP ratio? Gives you a way to compare across other countries, gives you somewhat of a metric of your country's ability to service the debt, shows your debt levels over time. The chart you're looking at here, point number three, shows our debt levels historically and currently. The highest our debt levels ever were at the pinnacle of World War II, when we were borrowing to save the free world. They came down thereafter, and they've been rising in recent years. The president took office with some of the highest debt levels that we've had in our country's history, about double our historic average over the last 50 years. So he inherited a difficult situation. However, point number four, while our situation right now at our debt levels are high, they are projected to skyrocket as far as the eye can see due to those permanent trillion-dollar annual deficits I talked about earlier. Our debt levels are expected to exceed the size of the economy in about the next 10 years. They're going to exceed those record World War II levels in the decade thereafter, and then continue on an upward trajectory for the decades thereafter. Point number five, what's going on here? What is causing these deficits? What's contributing to them other than the obvious of spending exceeding revenues? There's a two-part story here that I want to convey. In the immediate term, the story is largely a self-inflicted harm. We've done some analysis at our organization that shows that about 60% of the deficits that are occurring right now are the result of legislation passed by Congress and enacted into law in the last couple of years. These include tax cuts that were not paid for. They include bipartisan spending packages, several of them that were not paid for. And all of these have added to our already deteriorating fiscal situation. But over the medium and long term, the story is a little bit different. So point number 6 is a really important point I want to emphasize here. 80% of the projected spending growth over the next 10 years at the federal level is attributable to 3 things: Social Security, health care spending, and interest costs on the national debt. 80% of the spending growth over the next 10 years are attributable to those 3 things. And when you don't have revenues that are keeping pace with that spending growth, it's leading to a big structural gap of ever-accumulating deficits and debt. Point number 7 is kind of the point of what's driving that. Okay, what's driving that? What's driving it is an aging population, and associated with that, although different, rising health care costs. I had a former boss who used to say, on these issues, the new 4-letter word that's coming to Washington is math. It is math, right? You look at these numbers here, these numbers are meant to convey, in the decades after Social Security was created, you had 16 workers paying in to the programs for every 1 person receiving benefits. That ratio has dramatically changed as we've aged as a population. Other demographic factors, longer life expectancy, changes in birth rates have changed this scenario over time. Ratio went to 3-to-1 earlier this decade. It's going to go to 2-to-1 in the not too distant future. It's creating big structural gaps in some of these big Social Security and health care programs that are leading to significant fiscal challenges. Number 8, I emphasized this before, that there are 3 areas that are driving projected spending growth mainly over the next 10 years. Interest costs, debt service costs on our national debt are the fastest growing line item in the federal budget. Healthcare spending is the fastest growing programmatic area in the federal budget, but as a line item cost, the cost to service our debt are the fastest growing costs in the federal budget. Point number 9 is that we spend about $382 billion. The last fiscal year was on that debt service cost. Those are going up very fast, as I just showed you. About 40% of those interest costs are being paid overseas. China, Japan get a significant chunk of that. About a quarter of our interest goes to a variety of other countries. So a lot of those interest costs are going overseas. And we get asked this question a lot, in case it's a question after, I'll answer it now. Those interest assumptions take into account that we have a very low interest rate environment right now. Take that already into account. So these projections are very sensitive to changes in interest rates. They assume low interest rates, a 1 percentage point higher in interest rates, and we get another $1.9 trillion in debt over the next 10 years, based relative to these projections. Point number 10, everything I've been talking about so far when it comes to our projected fiscal situation was dealing with mainly the categories of spending, what are the drivers of spending. What the point number 10 I want to make here is it's more about how we're controlling this spending, what the budget process is in Washington to address these things. Here's the key point. There's mainly 2 categories of spending at the federal level, called discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is mainly a lot of those categories of spending that most people, I would argue, typically associate with government. They're the ones that fund the administrative agencies at most of the departments in Washington. They're the ones that fund they fund defense, they fund Homeland Security, they fund a lot of the transportation, our federal education programs, research and development costs are all coming out of the discretionary budget. They are the ones that when you hear about on the news when people are talking about the budget negotiations in Washington, they're talking about the discretionary budget largely. Mandatory spending, kind of like it sounds, mandatory spending is based on those programs that have certain eligibility criteria and people that are eligible or organizations that are eligible for these programs, and they automatically grow every year without having to have budgetary decisions made. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the major health care programs are examples of mandatory programs. So is SNAP, food stamps. Those kind of programs are mandatory programs largely that grow automatically every year. Here's the point. 30% of the budget is those discretionary ones. About 60% is mandatory. So we are, not only is the budget growing unsustainably, we're actually losing control of the budget as well. So it's 60% is mandatory now, it's going to go to 70% in the next 10 years. Point number 11 is, comparatively to other countries, the United States has the fastest growing debt levels compared to any other industrialized country in the world. The International Monetary Fund looked at this earlier this year, looked at OECD countries, and showed that the United States is one of 4 countries that has projected debt levels growing over the next 5 years, and the United States being the fastest growing. Now, part of the reason why our debt problems have not come home to roost yet is that from an economic standpoint, compared to the rest of the world, we're still looking pretty good. So that matters. The point here is we're heading in the wrong direction relative to the rest of the world from a fiscal situation. Point number 12, here's the point I want to make here, is there's no silver bullet, easy solution here to our fiscal situation. A lot of people have proposed that here's what you need to do. You just need really fast economic growth, get tons of revenues coming in. We can close that fiscal gap with economic growth. That's what we need to do. We need economic growth. Economic growth is not going to solve this fiscal situation that I'm talking about. All different sorts of economists who are studying what projected growth is going to be over the next several decades, because we're an aging population, we're going to have historically low growth compared to what we've had before. It would take unprecedented levels in the United States history of sustained economic productivity growth to close that gap on just economic growth alone. Point number 13, this does have consequences in people's individuals' pocketbooks and wallets. Now, I'm the first to admit, as a budget policy group in Washington tries to advance action on this issue, trying to portray what the consequences of an action on this issue are is our biggest challenge. It's really hard because it doesn't translate well into why it should matter to someone's life. But there are a lot of consequences about how this issue is going to impact people. One of them is economics in their wallet. The Congressional Budget Office has studied this, and over the next several decades, per person on average income will be lower over time because of a failure to address our fiscal situation. And there are a range of other consequences to not dealing with this. As I just said, economic impacts. The reason that being is that the more federal borrowing can crowd out more private investment in the economy, leading to slower economic growth that would otherwise be the case. Lower wages. It can contribute to higher interest rates across the economy, which can impact, obviously, individuals and businesses. It has budgetary effects at the federal level, meaning that the more you're spending on those interest costs, those things that are growing automatically, the less room and flexibility you have in your budget to be spending on other things that you may want to spend on, or the less flexibility you have to respond to a unexpected domestic or foreign emergency. You could have a fiscal crisis eventually if you don't get this under control. And what I mean by that is a situation where all of a sudden, precipitously and unpredictably, those who lend the United States money would want to charge a much higher interest rate than currently because they don't trust our ability to pay anymore. That could lead to a very fast economic crisis. History has showed that this has happened in other parts of the world when people have lost control of their fiscal situation. Now, this isn't happening tomorrow. It's not happening next year, probably the next few years, given how the United States economy is to the rest of the world. But our point is, it's not prudent, right, to keep going on like this to risk a situation like that down the line. So it could precipitate a crisis. And then if that's not enough, to me, the reason I got involved in this, I said at the outset, was these bigger sort of moral questions, somewhat as it relates to the federal budget. And I got involved in this before I had kids. I now have 5- and 7-year-old kids. Point number 14, we're going to spend more, in the next couple of years, we're going to spend more in a given year on interest on our national debt than the entire federal government spends on anything that goes towards programs that support kids in a given year. Now, I think there's legitimate discussion and debate about whether the federal government should have the right role in some of these federal programs that go towards supporting kids. I think that is a legitimate discussion to be had. But I would be happy to debate anyone that thinks the priorities here are right in terms of spending more to service your past than you are to be investing in your future. So this is a moral issue in our view as well. Now, point number 15. I'm done with all the budget sort of numbers now. Now I'm pivoting a little bit into the political dynamics, political situation here. This was kind of fun. We had some of our analysts at the office. This actually took a lot of time. We did a little sort of mini study, we called it, where we basically were watching all the presidential primary debates. Because part of what we do at our organization, we issue analyses and reports on a lot of things related to the budget, but we fact check, analyze what's going on in the presidential campaigns as well. We've been watching the debates, and here's our freshly updated mini study from Wednesday evening. Yeah, there's been 16 hours of Democratic debates, 421 questions asked. And it took, you had to come up with our own methodology of what counts as a question. It's kind of hard. 421 questions asked. If you're watching those debates, you might recall 0. Not one has been asked at all about our budget situation, our deficits, our debt, Social Security, or anything related to this. Now, granted, there's been a lot of discussion about how you're paying for certain priorities. I'm not going to say that hasn't been taking place, but there hasn't been focused attention on these issues, which we obviously, as a budget group, aren't happy about. And it's also unfortunate because there are ideas out there, and many ideas that have been talked about for years, on how you can approach solving this budget problem. What you'll see up here is a framework for how you deal with this that's been talked about in Washington for years, but I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I'm happy to talk about it in questions with anyone after. But look, we need policymakers that first need to acknowledge the problem, put it on the agenda. It's not happening right now. They actually just have to say, this is a problem. You need to pay for your agenda. Pay as you go is a principle in Washington and unfortunately has gone away. The need to, anytime you want to enact new tax cuts, new spending increases, pay for them. If you just stop making the situation worse, that would actually be very beneficial from our fiscal situation. And then you have to just assess, given what the numbers say, you have to look at this and say, we're going to have to address, obviously, some of those big drivers of spending over time if we're going to turn that trajectory, right? We've got to look at healthcare spending. We have to figure out how we're going to reform healthcare programs in this country that bend that cost curve on healthcare. We're going to have to look at how to make Social Security solvent, because that is critically important, because Social Security is the most popular, and I would argue for good reason, federal program that there is, but it is insolvent in and of itself. And if it's made solvent, we'll have significant benefits at the for the federal budget. We're going to have to look at our tax code, revisit some of the tax efforts that have taken place in the last few years, because to deal with this issue comprehensively, almost all the bipartisan efforts that have looked at this have said you're going to need some more revenue over time here to close that fiscal gap. So there's a lot that can be done, and I can talk about all the different options and stuff that are out there, and we as an organization we're not out there pushing one particular plan. We are out there educating people about the issue, offering a variety of policy options in a lot of these areas that members of Congress can use to address this. But there is a lot that can be done to solve this issue. But in spite of all that, the issue here is we're not naive, right? I am not expecting Washington at any moment to all of a sudden start to really focus attention on this issue. And that's because we believe that the budget issues have really actually come to represent much bigger fundamental problems that are going on in our political system right now. Our political system pretty much defers making all tough choices right now on a range of issues. We're polarized. That's an apolitical statement that has nothing to do, in my view, in terms of the current leadership in Washington. We've been growing more polarized for many years now, and we can't compromise on a range of issues that need to be addressed. The budget being one of them, but there are a range of others as well. We continuously focused on short-term political gain at the expense of long-term issues. And this has been going on for a long time. And we as an organization, in addition to educating and engaging on the budget, we've started our own project in the last year that has tried to look at and examine why is it that our policymakers in Washington can't solve some of these problems, can't address these issues. And we believe it's due to a range of factors that have been driving polarization over time. The thing that we've been heartened by is as we've worked on some of the issues of what's driving polarization, what to do about it, there's actually a lot of ideas people are talking about out there of how can we actually maybe change our political system a little bit to allow for more negotiation, compromise. Okay, right now, in many ways, the system is set up to incentivize people to not be solving problems, right? We have to tweak those incentives. On this slide, if you can't see it, this is just we don't have a stated position on which one of these ideas are right, but a lot of people have been talking about, you got to deal with how we gerrymander congressional districts. Perhaps we need term limits. We got to deal with money in politics. Some of these issues that might result in a system that'd be more prone to working together and compromise. Now that I've really depressed you, in spite of all this, hope is really not lost. I was speaking to the folks before my remarks that there's actually a lot of members of Congress that want to really do the right thing on this. They are educated. They are engaged on this. Senator Sinema, I was mentioning before, is really engaged on these issues, as are some of the members of the House, too. Representative Schweikert, in particular, is someone that we've engaged with a lot and has focused a lot of attention on these fiscal issues. So there's a lot of members that want to do the right thing, but for the reasons I said, this is politically really, really hard in our climate right now. So part of the reason that we're going out talking about this issue and spending the time traveling around, speaking with community leaders about this, is we don't believe this is going to be some massive grassroots issue on the budget. That's not going to happen. But what can be beneficial is to have community leaders talking to policymakers and telling them, please, yeah, do the right thing on this. We know it's tough, but stand up, show leadership, bring attention to this issue, start working on it. And so anything that folks can do to encourage policymakers in Washington to do the right thing, because they're there, they just need to hear it, would be really appreciated. Anything else to do to raise attention to these issues, we go to forums all the time like this, so if folks want to host us, especially in Arizona, we'd be glad to come back. And then the last thing I'll say before taking your questions is I mentioned it that we've started this new effort that's trying to look at and examine what's driving some of our polarization in this country. It's called Fix Us. You can text that number up there if you want to get signed up for it. You can see it on our website. But it's a whole new project we're starting and rolling out over the next year that's basically going to examine research, bring research to why our country's become polarized, try to draw attention to potential solutions in that regard, and build support for those that want to get involved in those solutions. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
A couple of questions for me, and that is, one, what is your annual budget? And two, who is writing the checks? Your three largest people, and if you want to pass on the question, you can, I'll understand.
No, I won't pass on that. Our annual budget as an organization is about $3.5 million. We're about a 20 to 25 person staff in Washington that analyzes the budget, and we rely on a ton of volunteers around the country to try and raise attention to these issues. So that's the answer to the budget question. We are funded because we're a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, charity, so we receive donations from a variety of sources. Large grant-making foundations give us a decent amount of funding in our budget from a variety of foundations, as well as individual contributors across the country that share an affinity to our cause. We're always looking for people that want to provide us more funding.
Couldn't we just raise the level of the age for eligibility for Social Security and raise the contribution level for Medicare and slow the increase in disability benefits, the Social Security or Medicare disability? And wouldn't that solve our problem?
First, a statistical point. Social Security is going to be insolvent in the early 2030s. Around 2033, based on trustees' estimates, the trust funds will become insolvent, and it would necessitate over 20% across-the-board cut for everyone on Social Security. That includes those that are retiring right now, okay? they'll be receiving Social Security by the time they're the early 2030s. So this is not, a lot of people talk about Social Security as a very long-term issue that we got, and it's not long-term anymore. Okay, this is coming, it's impacting current retirees. As to your solutions, okay, here's what I would say about that. I think Social Security is probably the best example of an issue where if you go around Washington and talk privately to those that know about these issues on Capitol Hill, they kind of know ultimately kind of what the makeup of that Social Security package is going to be. It's just a question of when, okay? But the problem is that the longer you wait, the more draconian the changes are going to have to be, okay? So, but if it were to be right now, some of the changes include some of the things that you were just saying. So you could adjust the eligibility age, not dramatically. It's already going up right now a little bit. You basically would have it go up a year incrementally, a month or so every year, what have you, for the next couple of decades, okay, and give people plenty of time to adjust. Okay, so you could adjust the eligibility age for Social Security. That's one. Two is you got to look at how the revenue comes into the Social Security program. So right now, many of you probably know on the payroll tax side of things, Social Security payroll taxes are capped at about $130,000. So above that, payroll taxes stop. Okay, but you don't get benefits, you know, above obviously $130,000 either. That amount is set. It's supposed to set to cover a certain amount of wages, right? And so back in the 80s or so, that cap used to set about 90% of wages. It's down to about 80. So a lot of proposals out there talk about let's adjust that cap a little bit. It can go up. Not a huge. Some people talk about eliminating it completely. That could happen. But most people also talk about let's adjust that. Let's have it go up 130, go up to 180, 200,000, something like that. Bring in some more revenue to the program. You tweak the benefit eligibility, okay, that the growth of benefits grow slower, not cut. They just grow slower for those at the wealthier end of the spectrum compared to those at the lower end of the income spectrum. So not means test, but kind of adjust how the benefits are calculated based on income. That and one or two other minor changes, that secures Social Security forever, okay? But the longer you wait, those types of changes are going to have to be a lot more draconian. Medicare is much harder. There are some kind of parallels there. There are ways you can tweak the way you do benefits to try and make them a little bit more means tested, or you know that wealthier beneficiaries can be paying in a little bit more relative to others. Those would help. But a lot of the Medicare reforms have to also basically be dealing with some of the other bigger drivers of healthcare spending in the economy. How do we pay for our healthcare system? How do we incentivize outcomes as opposed to just paying for, you know, every service that's performed? There's a lot of other structural reforms to our healthcare system that we need from Medicare. But the overall answer to your question is yes. If you were to address the growth of those programs, as I said before, 80% of the growth of the programs is due to Social Security, healthcare spending, and interest on our debt. So you start dealing with those, you solve the situation very quickly. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for being here, by the way. And you are not boring. You are actually quite exciting to hear all this stuff because we don't know it. If I were to be running for a political office, I think we'd all agree that in order for us to get more services, we have to spend more money, okay? If we want to spend more money, we have to bring in more money. Okay, now we have to find out how to make more money as a country, and that would be to raise taxes. I'm immediately not going to get elected. Because as soon as you say raise taxes, people go crazy. But that's the only way we can, we're basically 15, 18% short every year. Well, that just means you got to make more money. So I know we need to cut some of the programs maybe a little bit, but wouldn't it be just as, I know it's not going to happen, but wouldn't it be just as simple to all of us chip in a little bit more money?
Well, as I said at the outset, I'm not an economist. I tried to do this stuff, boil it down simply. Yeah, right? You either got to cut spending or increase revenues, right? Those are your options, or a combination of both, right? We tend to think that most of the look at this and the way this works, if you're going to try and do it on one side of the ledger, it's pretty draconian and pretty politically infeasible. So certainly additional revenues need to be part of the equation here. But I think the thing that gets lost is that, you know, when you're talking about increasing tax revenues, you're not necessarily talking about just massive increases in tax rates. There are ways to be bringing in more revenue to the federal government if you look at sort of our tax code and just evaluate the fact that we have over $1 trillion annually in the cost of what referred to as tax expenditures. So these are the range of, deductions, credits, exemptions, and other things that distort the tax code, a lot of inequities there. You can clean a lot of that up, clean up some of those inequities, don't touch rates at all, and bring in some more revenue. Now, yeah, someone's taxes is going up in that, but you could do it also in a way you form the tax code there that disproportionately goes to those at the higher end of the income spectrum. So but the answer to your question is yes, you need to focus this also on the revenue side of the ledger, but if you look at it, I think it obviously is probably more likely it's going to be a combination of spending reductions over time and revenue. Yes, sir.
What is your feeling about the implementation possibly of a national sales tax?
National sales tax? Or a value-added tax. I think a lot of people that look at the revenue question have certainly discussed that as a potential option. So they look at sort of the numbers, they see the fact that we're going to need some more revenue coming in, and there definitely are a lot of ideas out there that suggest, okay, reform our tax code as it is, try and figure out how to squeeze as much revenue as we can there in terms of maybe cleaning up the code in the ways I was just talking about. But perhaps, yeah, over time we need to figure out how do we add maybe a different revenue source, a value-added tax. We don't have an institutional position on that, but I think it's quite possible you could see that over time. The related one I'd give there is some of these things kind of have a two-for benefit in the sense that a lot of people that are talking about our challenges on climate change, we're not a climate group, but I'm sympathetic, obviously, to that challenge as well. It shares a lot of parallels if you think about it with the budget issue in terms of a long-term challenge. A lot of people talk about some taxes that you might be able to do to both incentivize more green energy, carbon taxes or related ideas in that regard, which could have a twofer. You could basically improve our environmental situation and figure out a way to bring in some more revenue for the federal government. Yes,
it seems to me that there's a relatively large underground economy of non-citizens who don't pay taxes at all. Is there a way to address that, to get more people to become citizens and to be in the normal economy where they're paying income tax and they're paying Social Security and Medicare and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. What I would say to that is one of the reform ideas that you'd look at in terms of where you can get some more additional revenue coming in is if you look actually the bipartisan immigration proposals that have taken place over the last several years, ones that combine sort of border security with some sorts of pathways to legalization and or some status, legal status, they actually are extremely beneficial from a fiscal situation because all of a sudden you start having actually additional payroll tax sort of revenue coming in. So immigration reform is actually, can be helpful to our fiscal situation. For sure. I think that probably answers your question. Yes, sir.
So I think this may be the last question, but we've talked about a number of things to do to change the trajectory, but addressing how you do it with the organizational structure. Maybe you could speak to the possibility of term limits.
Term limits?
Yes.
So when we go around the country, and I posed that question towards the end of that it's not necessarily just about our budget problem here. We got political system challenges. We got to figure out what we're going to do about that. Term limits, and you just did it again here, they are the most common idea proposed when you go out and talk to folks. As I said, we don't have an institutional position on term limits. Here's some of the trade-offs that we hear when we talk about term limits. There are a lot of studies that have shown, because a lot of states have term limits, that they actually have had negative effects when it comes to governing. It has to do, I believe, if I understand these analyses right, that when you start to lose institutional knowledge in terms of how to deal with these issues. That's one argument. Okay. The flip side of that argument is part of the issue going on in this country right now is a massive amount of distrust between our people and elected officials. And I think people see term limits as a way of holding elected officials accountable right? And to be not career politicians. So I think it is one of many issues that is on the table, I think, to be talked about. But I can't stand here and say it's like the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. It also requires, the last thing I'll say, because I think it's important to think about, to institute term limits at the federal level would require a constitutional amendment. And when you're talking about a system as polarized as we are right now, that can't get even things done from a majority. You're talking about a constitutional amendment that requires, see if I get this right, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, 3/4 of all state legislatures to enact it. I'm not sure about that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. On behalf of Operation School Bell, we have made a donation on your behalf. We thank you for coming today, and what a great discussion.